Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11. We'll read verses 13 through verse 16. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, that is, the promises, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country. And truly, if thou had been mindful of that country from whence they came out, they might have had opportunity to have returned. But now they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city. Again, the book of Hebrews contains exhortations, warnings, encouragement to Jewish Christians who were facing severe trials, much persecution, discouragement. As we've seen many times, Hebrews 10 verse 38 says, the just shall walk by faith. And that's simply a call to live by faith. Then we come to this 11th chapter, and the writer describes faith. He demonstrates or illustrates faith. The whole subject of Hebrews 11 is faith. The word occurs 24 times in this 11th chapter. And you'll see connected to that are the words by and through. By faith, through faith, which reveals that faith is a means of accomplishment. It is a means of accomplishing something. So Hebrews 11 is really faith in action. Faith in action. It's a record of ordinary men and women like ourselves doing extraordinary things by means of faith. It's a record of men and women who made a difference with their life, with their death. Again, the means being faith. It is a record of men and women that were a blessing and that were an encouragement to many. And to this day, they're still a testimony to children of God throughout the ages. And again, the means was faith. So it's really a record of the impact of faith in a life, the power of faith, the force of faith, the workings of faith, the achievements of faith in the lives of, again, ordinary people. So the chapter primarily tells of men and women who by faith walked out of step with the world. They were different. They were different. They also walked out of step with the times in which they lived. And they were triumphant in life. And it was all by or through faith. So what is declared here in Hebrews 11 is that there is a life that flows from faith. And that's always so. There is a life that flows from faith. So we see here how faith acts. We see that faith has life. Faith is active. Faith is energetic. Faith is vigorous. Faith is God energized. Faith is life-changing. And we come to our text here in Hebrews 11, verse 13, and we read, these all. These all. They all possess faith. Grammatically, the these all take in the persons previously mentioned, which would have been Abel, Enoch, Noah, and Abraham. But the wider application would refer to all the Old Testament saints. What is said there in verse 13 would have been true of all of them. So men and women who endured difficulties and afflictions, trials, oppositions of all kinds and obstacles in the cause of God. And they had faith. And their faith made a difference. It wasn't their talent. It wasn't their ability. It wasn't their personality. It wasn't their resources. It was these all had faith. And that's what made the difference. So I want to speak on the impact of faith. The impact of faith. We read this morning of a group of people who had an intellectual or head knowledge of faith. It made no impact upon their life. It didn't change the way they lived. Didn't change anything about them. But saving faith has an impact upon a life. Not only that, but it impacts for generations to come. So we want to look at the impact of their faith. The first thing we notice is the impact of their faith caused them to persevere. They didn't quit. Verse 13, these all died in faith. These all died in faith. They lived by faith, and they died the same way that they lived, in faith. That's generally true. People die as they live. They lived and died depending upon the Lord. That's what faith is. It's dependence upon God. They lived and died trusting the Lord. They lived and died leaning upon the Lord. They lived and they died believing the Lord. They lived and died with confidence in God. They lived and died with assurance in the Lord. They lived and died seeing afar off. They lived seeing things that others could not see, and they died seeing things that others could not see. They lived and died in the reality of the eternal and the invisible. They lived and died seeking and desiring what God had prepared for them. They lived expressing faith. They died expressing faith. They lived with a testimony, and they died with a testimony. They lived pleasing God, and they died pleasing God. Faith had an impact upon the way they lived. And they persevered, and eventually they died. And faith had an impact upon the way they died as well. They lived and they died in faith. That is, they just kept on. They persevered. Life is not easy, and they lived by faith. Dying is not easy, and they died in faith. Whatever came between life and death, they faced by faith And they just kept on going. They just persevered. Secondly, the impact of their faith made them willing to wait upon God. Verse 13, not having received the promises. All those Old Testament saints died before the incarnation of Jesus Christ. They did not physically see it. They never received in their lifetime the promise. But they had a faith that said, I believe the promises of God. They may never be fulfilled in my lifetime, but I believe it, and I'll wait for it. That's faith. Faith is willing to wait. God's people have an awfully hard time waiting. It's perhaps the most difficult thing in the Christian life. It requires faith. You can't do it without faith. I am willing that if it's not fulfilled in my life, I'm willing to wait for God. That's what this verse is saying. They had a faith that not only believed, but a faith willing to wait for God's time. It is a faith that enjoys the things promised even before we actually possess them. It is a faith that gives happiness in the expectant anticipation of the promises. It is a faith that made the promises of God so real that though not yet obtained, they found joy in just waiting for it. Faith. Third thing, the impact of their faith enabled them to see afar off. We spoke on that this morning. But having seen Him, or having seen them afar off, the them is the promises. In the midst of a dark world, filled with testing and trials and struggles and cares of all kinds and needs of all kinds, they saw something. They saw something greater than their trouble, greater than their testing, greater than all their struggles, and greater than all their needs. They saw the promises of God. And what they saw became very, very real to them. And though they lived in a world just like you and I, where God is not honored, God is not honored in this world, and God is not sought in this world, and God is not going to be honored, and God is not going to be sought, but God's people need to see what others cannot see. And then we do so by faith. We read in 2 Corinthians 5:7, for we walk by faith, not by sight. Faith can see much further than human eye. Much further. Abraham saw 4,000 years in advance. You and I can look back. We can go all the way back to creation and see the creation of God. Almost 7,000 years. In our text it says they see afar off. Can see further than the most powerful of telescopes. It sees eternity. It can see through and beyond all circumstances. Through and beyond the here and the now. It can see clearly a God who rules, a God who reigns, a God who can. What we see is more real to us than what we do not see. And when we can see God, He's more real to us. He's not more real, but He's more real to us. The problem is that so many of God's people, the only thing they can see is the here and the now. They can't get beyond that. They need faith. So we need to ask ourselves, how far can you see? How far can you see? Faith can see God. Fourthly, the impact of their faith made them sure. Notice verse 13 again. And were persuaded of them. Persuaded of the promises. The word persuaded means they had an assured confidence. Didn't look like the promises were going to get fulfilled, but they were persuaded. They were confident. They had conviction that it was so. Faith worked in their heart. Faith worked in their mind. And they were convinced it is so. That's how it should be with us. Doesn't matter what the world says. Doesn't matter what the world does as far as our faith is concerned. We are to be persuaded that thus saith the Lord is so. Thus saith the Lord is so. We're becoming a more secular society by the day. Brother Ellis's, I just put it up today, the letter of the bulletin board, said in Ireland the most common religion is no longer Catholicism. It's atheism. I believe that we're getting close to it. We're a secular society. We are a secular society. But faith, regardless of a secular society, is convinced, persuaded of God. That's the impact of faith. People say all the time, well, you know that so-and-so says such and such. Doesn't change anything. That doesn't change what I believe. It may even strengthen what I believe. The impact of faith. We need to examine the impact of our faith. What are we more sure of? What are we more certain of? What we can see with the human eye, or what we can see by faith? How persuaded are we of the promises of God? You see, because in a secular society, God is no longer in the picture in their minds. And we're bombarded with that by the day. But what are you more persuaded of? The foolishness of secularism or the truth of God? It's all a matter of faith. Are you persuaded enough in God to lean all your weight upon Him? Are you persuaded enough to cast all your cares upon Him? Are we persuaded enough to let go? Just lean upon Him? How persuaded are we of God? How persuaded are we of the promises of God? The more persuaded we are, the brighter it is. the more persuaded we are of God. It's a dark world depending on how you look at it. But persuasion in God, faith in God, it's pretty bright. The future's not dismal for the child of God. The future's bright. We ought to be getting excited. And the more persuaded we are in the promises of God, the more excited we become. Fifthly, the impact of their faith brought rejoicing and affection. It says there in verse 13, and embraced them. That is, they embraced the promises. The word embraced means it's a means of greeting. They embraced. They saw the promises of God afar off, and they welcomed them into their lives. They embraced them. The word embrace also is an expression of affection. They could see afar off the promises of God, and they had a love for what they saw. To embrace is to hug. It's to hold. It's to cling. To accept. To receive. You don't embrace someone that you want away from you. It's a receiving. And that they embrace the promises of God means they welcome them into their lives. They didn't push God out. They welcomed God into their lives. They did not push out the things of God. And yet that's what we see today. So many who profess to be God's people are pushing God more and more out, because that's what society does. We're in a society that is in the process of outlawing God. And God's people do the same thing. They're pushing God out. But faith won't do that. Faith will embrace God. Faith welcomes God into our lives. So we need to we need to make examination, what is it that we are embracing? What is it that we are welcoming into our lives, receiving into our lives? Is it God? Or is it secularism? Or anything else as far as that goes? What is it? Temporal things or spiritual things? The impact of faith. Does the heart love and cling to that which we can see with the physical eye? Or does our heart love and cling to that which we can only see by faith? What is it that we're embracing? Well, that depends upon our faith. It really does. It all goes back to faith. What do we welcome into our lives more? The temporal or the spiritual? What brings us more joy? The temporal or the spiritual? It's all a matter of our degree of faith. Sixthly, the impact of the faith produced a sense of detachment from the world. Verse 13, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. A stranger is, in the Bible, is one who's away from home. It's a foreigner. One who is not fully accepted. The figure of a stranger applied to the child of God, very pertinent. The stranger, the foreigner, if you will, often is not appreciated. Often is avoided because they're different. The habits, the ways, the language, of whatever country they're a stranger to, it's all strange to them. God's people, the habits, the ways, and the language of this world, it ought to be strange to us. And it's getting stranger all the time. If that's not so, you need to be greatly concerned. The stranger, unless he or she conforms to the ways of that foreign country which they're in, they're very easily identified. You can pick them out. They dress different. They talk different. They're just different. Unless they become the country that they're in, the difference is very easily seen. God's people are different. Our ways, our language, the way we view things, it's different. Unless you conform, which many have done, you're going to be a stranger. You're going to be different. Our thoughts are different unless we conform. Faith will keep one from conforming to the world's ways. But it says here they confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims. A pilgrim, also a stranger, but a pilgrim is just passing through for a short period of time. Just passing through for a short period of time. They have no interest in conforming because they're not staying. Just passing through. We ought to have no interest in conforming because we're not staying here. We're just passing through. Just passing through for a little while. The pilgrim never feels at home. Just passing through. You're in a car traveling somewhere, you go through a town, it doesn't feel like home to you. It's not home. You're passing through. You're passing through. The pilgrim carries nothing with him. That would be an encumbrance to their traveling. They just steadily press on toward home. That's to be us. That's to be us. That takes faith. They confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims. So a faith that has impact will keep this world from being your home. From being your home. We enjoy the life that God has given us in this world. But I sure hope we realize this isn't home. Just passing through. Just passing through, and God is so good that He lets us enjoy it. But we're just passing through. Don't dig your tent stakes in too far. This isn't your home. Faith always reminds us of that. A faith that has an impact will keep us, again, from driving our stakes too far into the ground. A faith that has an impact will prevent us from being weighted down with the things of the world. We're not going to encumber ourselves because we're just passing through. It'll prevent us from, a faith with impact will prevent us from being distracted by the country we're passing through. We don't have time to get distracted. We're just passing through. I got to get from here to there. Just passing through. Can't be distracted. That's the way our life is to be in this world. Seventhly, the impact of the faith caused them to seek and desire something different. And that is stated in verses 14 through 16. It says, "For they that say such things," what things? That they're strangers and pilgrims. Who confess that they are strangers and pilgrims by the way they live. They that say that declare plainly. That is, absolutely and clearly. We need to declare plainly. And what they declare is they seek a country. They're seeking something other than what's here. Faith will do that. To seek is to look for. It is to search. It's to hunt for, to pursue. They seek a country, and it's not here. It's in heaven. That's what they're seeking. The impact of faith causes one to seek something different than the rest of the world. It's a sad day when God's people are seeking the same thing that the world is seeking. It's a sad, sad time. It is to seek that which is beyond this world. We seek something that the world cannot give. The world can't give what we seek. And faith reminds us that all the time. So we seek beyond the world. And the world doesn't understand that. Nor should we expect them to. They seek what God has prepared for them. Notice also verse 15, that their faith not only caused them to seek something different than the rest of the world, but their faith had such an impact that it made them unmindful. That is, they had no compulsion for their former ways. It made them unmindful. They forgot. The impact of faith, verse 16, caused them to possess different desires. But now, they're unmindful of the old way, and now they desire a better country. That is, a heavenly. You see, the impact of faith creates a desire that is out of this world. It creates a desire for the spiritual over the temporal. The impact of faith causes one to see that spiritual things are superior and more advantageous than temporal things. The impact of faith causes one to seek and to desire the heavenly over the earthly. Fully persuaded that the heavenly is superior and more advantageous than the earthly. So from all that we see that when faith makes an impact, that'll keep your priorities in order. Faith will keep your priorities in order. Because faith seeks and desires the right things. When our priorities get out of order, it's because we seek and desire the wrong things in the wrong order. Faith won't do that. Oh, how we need the impact of faith. Most don't understand faith. But biblical faith operates quite simply. Here's how it works. God speaks. We hear what He speaks. We trust what He speaks. And we act upon what He speaks. That's faith. That's faith. It's very simple. God says something, you hear it, you believe it, you trust it, you act upon it. That's faith. That's living by faith. Very simple. Of course, it's not easily done because it requires faith. You can't do this You can't just roll out of bed and say, you know what? I'm going to determine if God says it, I believe it, and I'm going to trust Him, I'm going to do it. Well, you won't do that without faith. Without faith. Because here's how it works. God speaks, but so does so-and-so. And so-and-so says something differently than God. Okay, now you're challenged. Who are you going to believe? God or man? Who are you going to trust? Who are you going to base your activity upon? Faith is God speaks, regardless of what anyone else does or says, regardless of what happens or doesn't happen. I'm going to trust God. I'm going to act upon what God says. That's faith. That's a wonderful life. There is no better life on this earth. So the impact of faith enables one to live in the awareness of God. That's what faith does. It's always aware of God. A secular world wants to forget God, eliminate God, eliminate Him from all thoughts. That's why people get so upset today. I mean, angered. Just mention God, and they're in a rage because they're in a crusade to eliminate Him. That's secularism. And then we live in a secular world. It's a religion. It's a religion of atheism. But faith lives in the awareness of God. Faith lives in dedication to God, commitment to God, surrender to God. And it was faith that caused the these all of our text to pursue and to serve God. And it is faith that causes you and I to pursue and serve God. It was faith that caused the these all to live lives of nonconformity and transformation. And so it is with us. It was faith that caused the these all to obey and follow God and to enjoy God. And it was faith in God that filled them with peace and assurance. Faith. Oh, the impact of faith. Our establishment in the matters of God, our spiritual prosperity are closely related to our faith. In 2 Chronicles 20:20, here's what we read. Believe in the Lord your God. That's faith. Believe. So shall ye be established. So shall you be established. Believe, so shall you be established. You'll be as established as your faith. Believe in the Lord your God, so shall you be established. Believe, there it is again, faith, ye His prophets, so shall ye prosper. So shall ye prosper. A life lived by faith is a life of spiritual prosperity. Faith is how we're not mastered. We're not controlled. We're not governed by circumstances. We're not governed by those things. A life lived by faith is how one ascends spiritually and stays connected to God. A life lived by faith will enable one to worship God no matter what. Will enable one to draw closer to God no matter what. A life lived by faith enables one to see Him, to look to Him, to lean upon Him, to draw from Him, to cleave to Him, and to cast all upon Him. Oh, for a faith that will impact our lives, that will change our lives. And that's why another reason we ought to pray with the apostles, Lord, increase our faith. Cause it to be a force in our lives. Cause it to be a force in our lives. Well, I just want to have a good time in the life that God's given me. Then you'll never serve God. You'll never serve Him. You'll never be of much use to God in this life. God help us. God grant us a faith that will be a force in our life. Brother Ben, if you'll come and lead us in verse of song, let's all